Alright, what's going on everyone, and welcome to a brand new series where we discuss horribly broken, degenerate decks in Magic the Gathering's history that were so powerful they needed to be banned. Today we'll be covering a deck featuring my favorite creature type in Magic, Eldrazi. This is the Eldrazi Winter disaster that killed Modern for 3 months. So Eldrazi have an interesting history, first unveiled in January 2010 in the Rise of Eldrazi set. They were at the time some of Magic's biggest creatures ever printed. They were so large in fact that they were basically unplayable in any fair way, and instead were primarily used in Reanimator decks or other combo decks that tried to cheat them into play. Wizards of the Coast actually foresaw this, which is why the Eldrazi Titans couldn't hit the graveyard. If they get put into the graveyard, they get shuffled back into the library. Wizards clearly didn't want us cheating these into play, and instead gave us Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin. Both of these can add 2 mana. Technically the Eye reduces the cost of Eldrazi by 2, but they make Eldrazi easier to cast. The problem is, reducing an Eldrazi cost from 12 to 10, doesn't really do a whole lot, so they were still largely unplayable. There was a ramp deck in Standard called Eldrazi Green, so they weren't terrible, but they didn't exactly break the game, considering they were some of the biggest creatures we had ever seen. That would change 5 years later during the Battle for Zendikar block. The first set gave us our first taste of low-cost Eldrazi, the catch being that they required colors of mana to cast. You couldn't even use the original lands to cast some of the multicolored Eldrazi because they didn't have colorless mana in their cost, so it wasn't terrible at first. But then came Oath of the Gatewatch, and this set would cause Modern to just absolutely implode. The set had Matter Reshaper, Thought-Knot Seer, and Reality Smasher. The first is a 3-mana 3/2 that will replace itself with another card when it dies. You either get a free permanent that costs 3 or less straight on the battlefield, or you draw a card. Thought-Knot Seer is a 4-mana 4/4 that looks at your opponent's hand, rips out a non-land, and it will replace it with a new card when it dies, but taking your opponent's best card and replacing it with a random one off the top eventually is still pretty good. And Reality Smasher is a 5-mana 5/5 with Trample and Haste that's difficult to target because the opponent has to discard a card, forcing the opponent to 2-for-1 themselves if they want to remove it. So these are fine, they're fairly powerful, but they don't really seem that broken, right? Like Ward, discard a card is something we see. A 3-mana 3/2 that replaces itself, like that's fine. But the problem of course is those lands from 5 years ago, Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin. The Temple taps for 2 mana, and the Eye of Ugin reduces the cost of Eldrazi by 2. So with any combination of these, if you have 2 of them, you can cast Thought-Knot Seer on turn 2, giving you a turn 2 4/4 that thought seizes the opponent, and then you could play a Reality Smasher the following turn, so on turn 3, you're attacking for 9 damage, and you got to rip out one of your opponent's best cards before the Reality Smasher hit. And this is even more powerful with Eldrazi Mimic. This is a 2-mana 2/1 that, when a colorless creature enters, it can copy its power and toughness. Since this only costs 2 mana, you could play multiples of these on turn 1 with the help of Eye of Ugin. It reduces its cost by 2, so it becomes a 0-mana 2/1. So imagine playing 2 of these on turn 1, following it up with a Thought-Knot Seer on turn 2. They each become 4/4s, so you attack for 8, and then you could play a Reality Smasher on turn 3. The Mimics become 5/5s, and you can attack for 19. So by turn 3, you can attack for 27 damage, not to mention you could force a discard with Thought-Knot Seer. And this one could also be played for free with Eye of Ugin, giving you multiple free 2/2s on turn 1, not to mention they could just be massive threats in the late game if you have multiple Eldrazi Temples, and some decks would run Simian Spirit Guide as well. It can be exiled from your hand for free for red mana, which could actually allow you to play Reality Smasher on turn 2. It wasn't impossible to play 2 Eldrazi Mimics on turn 1, then on turn 2 play a Reality Smasher and attack for 15. The rest of the deck was very flexible, and there were multiple builds. Dismember, Chalice of the Void, and Ratchet Bomb were played in more controlling decks. Some decks went into Azorius for Eldrazi Sky Spawner, Drowner of Hope, and Eldrazi Displacer, which made it more mid-rangey. There were Gruul decks that played Ancient Stirrings, Worldbreaker, and Kozilek's Return, and there was a super aggressive Izzet build with Eldrazi Obligator, Vile Aggregate, and Ruination Guide. So the first major tournament to take place after the release of Oath of the Gatewatch was the Pro Tour, which featured 6 Eldrazi decks and 2 Affinity decks in the top 8. 1 month later was Grand Prix Detroit, once again with 6 Eldrazi decks in the top 8 and 10 decks out of the top 16. Grand Prix Bologna also had 5 Eldrazi decks in the top 8 and 9 out of the top 16. The deck was so oppressive that the format became known as Eldrazi Winter, and Modern became a 3 to 4 deck format. You were either playing Eldrazi or one of the 2 to 3 decks that had any chance of beating it, those largely being Affinity, Living End, or Creature Toolbox decks, and literally every single other archetype in existence basically ceased to exist. Finally, after 3 months of absolute dominance, on April 4th, 2016, Wizards of the Coast announced that Ayavugan would be banned, finally putting an end to the Eldrazi decks in Modern. Well, sort of. If it's any testament to how broken the deck was, even after the bans, Eldrazi were a top meta deck for a while. Swapping Ayavugan for Noble Hierarch, the deck could still use Eldrazi temples to power out super aggressive Eldrazi. 2 Eldrazi temples could still result in a turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer and a turn 3 Reality Smasher, so it was still possible, it was just less likely and less consistent. So even though sometimes you would still get run over by the deck, there was a bit more luck involved. So since the deck couldn't rely on having a super aggressive start every game, it fell back on a Bant mid-range strategy with the Noble Hierarch and some Bant Eldrazi that were good at generating card advantage. So the deck was still very powerful, but it did slowly fade into obscurity. With no fresh Eldrazi being printed, the rest of the metagame would outpace it, and this would be sped up by the release of Modern Horizons, which massively boosted most decks, but still left Eldrazi with no new cards to keep up with the rising power level of the format. However, there's no doubt that Modern Eldrazi was one of the most powerful decks in the game's history, and Eldrazi Winter was one of the most broken metagames to ever exist in Magic. So if you like this video and you want to see more like it, well, technically you can't because this is the first one, but if you're watching this at a later date, there will be a playlist dedicated to these banned decks, and you can find a link to that in the description below. I hope this was interesting, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.